Welcome to the Nails and Hammers podcast. I'm your host Kushal Shah. This podcast teaches new perspectives by walking through journeys and decision-making processes of different individuals. We welcome back Kuntal Joshi to the podcast and talk about what goes into the Everest expedition and deep dive into the journey from Mumbai to Kathmandu to Everest and back.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Thanks for coming again. So, in the first session, we talked about your journey towards veganism, your journey towards mountaineering. But here, like, I wanted to focus more about what happens during an expedition. So, let's start with the Everest expedition, for example.
Right.
So, your flight from Mumbai to Kathmandu to Everest and back to Mumbai. So, what all do you carry with you, first of all?
The expedition itself is pretty long drawn. Like there are multiple ways you can climb Everest, but let's say I'm just going to use the standard way for which is what most of people will do. So you'll fly into Kathmandu, and from there, what I call is we start the first stage of a three-stage journey to get to the top. So let's say stage one is where you walk to the base camp of Everest, and this is about a 8 to 10 day journey.
So, you walk from Kathmandu to the base camp.
You actually take a flight from Kathmandu to a small village called Lukla, which is like the starting point of the hike. Now you can walk from Kathmandu to Lukla. No one does that anymore.
Okay.
But probably back in 1953, when Sir Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing climbed Everest, they did that.
Okay.
And many people after that also did that. We
Okay.
no longer do that.
Okay.
There are ways where you can either take a flight or take a helicopter or even potentially take a road route to a
Okay.
certain portion of the way and then probably hike up to Lukla. So multiple ways. The easiest is to take a flight, get into Lukla, and from there the journey starts. And it's
Okay.
about a 10-day hike all the way to the base camp. Again, you can do it in a shorter period of time. But generally, when we go through, we are also acclimatizing and we are using the time to also in some sense prime ourselves for the rest of the journey,
Okay.
because a lot of times people will train for many months or many years and then take a short break before they kind of come into
Mhm.
Everest. And so we also want to take this time to, like, our bodies are suddenly getting this stress of
Mhm.
walking longer distances, going to altitude, so we want to let them slowly get
Okay.
primed for what is coming on the climb. So then stage one is over. Once we are at the base camp, of course, we spend time adjusting to the environment there and
Okay.
we do some revision of our skills and some training and all of those things.
Okay.
And then we start climbing the mountain essentially. And this is the stage two.
Okay.
And this is the longest stage. It can take anywhere up from 10 days to 25 days, 30 days,
Okay.
depending on how the weather is, depending on what team you are climbing with or what your mindset about acclimatization is. I personally, for example, when I climbed Everest, I reached the base camp around 13th or 14th April.
Okay.
And for me, this phase was approximately almost more than 30 days because we
Okay.
were literally training and acclimatizing all the way from April 13th to May 15th.
Okay.
And during that, this stage, we use a strategy called climb high and sleep low. And the
Okay.
whole idea about the strategy is that you climb to a high point in the beginning. Let's say we go from base camp to camp one, and then we spend a few nights at camp one. This allows our body to acclimatize to a higher altitude. The only issue is that you like then we have to come back down to base camp. The question I always get is then why don't you just go to camp two?
Mhm.
The problem is that your body at altitude is starting to wear and tear very quickly.
Mhm.
You have to come down to a slightly thicker oxygen level so that you can recover. You can eat
Okay.
more food. You can support it with that nutritional and extra oxygen so that it can recover from that wear and tear. And then now you are kind of ready to go back and do this up again, the same cycle again, but this
Okay.
time getting to a slightly higher altitude. And the adjustment that I'm talking about is your body building extra red blood cells.
Yeah.
And so when your body builds extra red blood cells, the environment is not changing. The environment still, the air pressure is lacking. Consequently, the oxygen saturation is lacking. But if the number of red blood cells increase, then whatever oxygen is available, there are more cells that can, take that oxygen and push it across your body. And that way you can, kind of still work with a lower oxygen saturation available in your blood.
Okay.
And then let's say the second time you went to maybe 23,000 feet. The first time you went to 21,000, the second time to 23,000. Maybe you go back up the third time and then you touch about 25,000.
Okay.
The same cycle, you go up, spend a few nights, come back down,
So you come back all the
recover
way to base camp?
all the way down to base
Okay.
camp. Because base camp is also something where good food is accessible, the terrain is less riskier.
Yeah.
It's just better for recovery. Like someone could, argue that hey, you go to camp 3, why don't just come back down to camp 1? But camp 1 is a terrible place to live in. I would not even spend like more than few nights there. It's just not the best place to recover. It's cold, you are miserable, sleeping on snow, drinking water, by boiling snow, not the best thing. Plus no access to good food and any of those things. So this phase could take any, like I know of people who have come as late as April 25th and just spent 10 days in this phase. And consequently, someone like me who comes, a lot earlier spends a lot more time in the phase because the weather is just not optimum higher up the mountain to climb the mountain.
Okay.
So once this phase is over or you're reasonably confident that you have acclimatized, you have to wait for the weather window to be good on the mountain so that you can actually climb to the top of the mountain. Because like considering a mountain like Everest, which is almost 9,000 meters, that is like approximately 30,000 feet, you are way close to the jet stream. And the jet stream is like blowing off the top of Everest for a significant period of time across the year. Now, jet streams can be like 300 kilometers per hour. Now, you can't climb in that kind of wind conditions or climatic conditions. But sometime in the middle of May, the jet stream typically tends to shift a little higher, which means that the winds on the summit of Everest actually go down drastically. Like they'll be down to almost 20, 30 kilometers per hour.
Okay.
But this is not like fixed date. Oh, every May 15th of the year, the jet stream is going to move. No, it could happen on May 5th, it could happen on May 15th, it could happen on May 25th. And there could be seasons where that may not happen at all.
And that explains the disaster that happened because like it opened only for a few days.
Correct. So the disaster that happened was in May 2019 and the jet stream just never went. It was just there all the time, relentlessly there, and people tested it. A lot of people tested, going in that jet stream, and people, got bit big time. Some of them lost fingers, lost toes, had lung infections, brain infections. Some of them even ended up dying. Traffic jams on the mountains, just chaos on the mountain. So yeah, things can, always go wrong. But anyway, so you have to wait for the right conditions, and if you get the right conditions, then the climb to the top is approximately 5 days from the base camp, and then back down it could easily be about, like if you are really strong, you can come back down the same day. I have not seen many climbers, like many commercial climbers, someone like me. Most of us will, take about 2 days to get back down, or 3 days, depending on how our condition is, depending on the conditions on the mountain and those kind of things. So that's generally how the climb is. Like the duration of the climb is paced, takes about, I would say, anywhere from 50 days to 70 days. Again, depending on what weather windows you are looking at, right? If someone came on April 25th and then submitted on 15th May, for them it's like 30-day climb.
Yeah.
But for someone like me who shows up at 10th April at the base camp, starting at 1st April and going back home on May 30th, and that's almost a 60-day expedition. So
Yeah.
a lot depends on how you are kind of doing. I even know of this lady in the US. I don't know. I think she lived in Seattle, if I'm not wrong. But she literally went from the door of her house to Everest, but she went on the north side
Okay.
to the top of Everest and back home in Seattle. I don't remember if it was Seattle or Colorado, somewhere,
Okay.
in like 14 days.
Oh wow.
So now she completely skipped a whole bunch of steps because she spent 6 months sleeping in a tent in her house, a tent that was set up at a certain altitude.
Interesting.
Because there are these, altitude simulating tents that are available that you can use even at sea level, and then simulate higher altitudes of Everest. And then you can easily skip the acclimatization step on the mountain, like something which is called rapid ascent style.
Okay.
I don't like that because for me, climbing is a fun process, is a challenging process, and I don't like skipping steps.
Mm-hmm.
But to each their own. If
Yeah.
someone doesn't have time and still wants to climb Everest, then probably that's the safest way. You pre-acclimatize. You are ensuring that you're not, like just showing up and saying, okay, I'm just going to challenge acclimatization. That's not going to, work well. But
Mhm.
net, I'm going to say a traditional journey is going to be anywhere around 50 days average, 55 days average, and consist of multiple stages of climbing. And I know that I took a long time and I've still not answered your question that what do we take? Of course, there's a fair bit of gear that is involved. Gear that is personal gear that we wear. It could be our clothing, it could be specialized jackets, could be specialized equipment. So our boots are very specialized. And then just our sleeping bags, and then we would carry food as well.
Mhm.
Because yes, at the base camp we are very well stocked and we have access to fresh vegetables and fruits and just regular meals. But
Okay.
higher up we don't have access to any of those, so we kind of carry all that. And
Okay.
as a vegan, I have to ensure that I'm carrying enough vegan food that I can kind of fuel myself really well on the mountain. So that is one piece, and then there's of course a lot of group care as well,
Mhm.
in terms of ropes and in terms of tents and in terms of just the mountain equipment, the technical equipment that is required to safely open the route on the mountain. So there's
Okay.
a whole bunch of these things. And I remember, had two massive duffel bags and a big rucksack. I
Okay.
think I think total I carried was approximately some 65, 70 kilos worth of gear and food on the mountain. And yeah,
So you carried all the way from Mumbai to, I mean, base camp?
right. So of course, this was through a flight, and then through, if you are talking about north side of Everest, a car directly goes all the way to the base camp
Oh,
itself. Like literally to a tent, the car is going to park outside your tent. So so on the China side, there's a proper concrete highway all the way to the base camp.
interesting.
So you can of course carry a lot more on the Chinese side. On the Nepal side, you have porters who carry all these bags, or if you are able to manage a helicopter, then a lot of these gear mostly these days flies in a helicopter.
Okay.
So a helicopter would dump all your gear on the base camp, and then
Makes sense. And also, like, I've also heard about a prayer ceremony before an expedition begins. So what's that about?
right. So it's basically, in, I would say, maybe part of Tibetan Buddhism, or maybe part of the Sherpa culture, or maybe just part of the mountaineering Sherpa culture, is where they are kind of asking permission from the mountain that we would like to climb. Uh, because for them, let's consider the, like, Everest is called Sagar Matha in Nepali. But for example, the Tibetan name or the Sherpa name is Chomolungma, and Chomolungma is their mother goddess.
Okay.
And so it's like, they are climbing a god because it's their mother goddess. So they want to ask permission and they want to ask forgiveness, and they go through this very elaborate ritual where they kind of are saying we respect you, and that that we are asking for permission to climb. And until the ceremony actually happens, they don't really, like, we don't officially start climbing. They may start working on the mountain, in the sense, fixing certain portions of the mountains and like setting up the camps and ferrying a bit of loads, but they won't even do a lot of that. They'll just do like
Mhm.
really, really bits and pieces of it. But us climbers will only start officially climbing, even the acclimatization rotations. Like
Okay.
the very first time we step foot on the mountain, it is only after the puja is done or the ceremony is completed. So
That's interesting.
I think in some sense it's also probably in most cultures where before beginning something, we are like,
Yeah.
people will pray to God, or people will ask for permission or those kind of things. So it's quite similar in that sense, where they are considering the mountain their god and they're asking for permission.
Makes sense. And on another note, so there is the in Shishapangama, you cannot even climb to the true summit because it's sacred in a sense.
Right. Or for that matter, even Kanchenjunga, which is again a sacred mountain for the people of Sikkim.
Yeah.
For the people of Sikkim, because Kanchenjunga is a mountain that lies like between India and Nepal. So half of it is in Nepal and half of it is in India. And then the people of Sikkim really consider it sacred. So when people get to the top of Kanchenjunga, they'll not really stand on the top.
Okay.
They'll just stand maybe a feet below the top,
Yeah.
like because it's a sacred mountain, so they
Yep.
don't want to step foot on the top in that
Yep.
sense.
Makes sense. Also, I mean, I'll just try to break down the Everest expedition into several small steps. So once you reach the base camp, you might have a team leader, expedition leader who would guide you and stuff. And the first step to climb the mountain is the Khumbu ice fall. So what is that about? And then how was your experience looking at the crevices, walking through the ladders and stuff?
Right. So once we are at the base camp, we've done the training, the puja is done. Khumbu as well is of course on the Nepalese side. So that is the first obstacle on the Nepalese side, and it's very tricky to describe. But I remember, hearing one of the climbers share this description about Khumbu ice fall that I really thought was, pretty cool way of describing it. So I'm just going to recollect and share that. Like imagine, for example, let's say you're living in a suburb in Seattle, and maybe you're living in downtown Seattle, and downtown Seattle is composed of many small apartment complexes and many high rises, and just many streets and filled with cars and everything. Now consider this to be completely made of snow and ice, like all these apartment complexes and the bigger buildings and the cars and everything with small, like alleys in between and roads in between. Now if you take this suburb and tilt it at an angle of about 30 to 35 degrees, and you make it such that it is moving 2 to 3 feet every day downwards,
Okay.
and that these blocks of snow and ice or these apartment complexes, these areas can crash anytime during the day, anytime during the night, anytime basically. And that is what, in some sense, Khumbu Icefall is all about. It's like this frozen river of ice, snow and ice, and it's like this maze that you are walking through. Generally, when you're not acclimatized, it takes a while to get through this
Okay.
area because you're just slow. Your first time going through the mountain. And I remember when I did Khumbu Icefall the first time, I think it took me like 7, 8 hours to cross the icefall.
Wow.
So 7, 8 hours, you are crossing through the icefall. Every step is at risk because you are going through this maze, and that maze of snow and ice that can crash anytime.
So it changes every day.
Every day, the
Okay.
route changes, all of it changes. It's just all very dynamic. Uh, but luckily, the Sherpas and the guides over a period of many years have worked really hard to find the safest possible route within the ice wall. Now, there's nothing safe in the ice wall.
Yeah.
So when I say safe, the safest possible route, I mean it in a relative sense,
Yeah.
like the least possible risk. It still could be, much riskier than anything else that you could do in your entire life. But in that context, they have figured out a route that is really reasonable. That if you are smart and you move through quickly with strategic breakpoints in between at areas which are not which are slightly less risky, and then you do it in the middle of night. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, most of us will start at 1, 2, or 3 in the night.
Okay.
That's the time when temperatures are the coldest. The ice and the snowpack like holds really well. Lesser chances of avalanches happening.
Okay.
So then you cross during that time period, and then you kind of just are above it around 7, 8 maybe in the morning. Once the first rays of sun are like really harshly hitting, but by then you are in less riskier terrain,
Okay.
and that's the kind of mindset we go through. I had seen Khumbu Icefall and the pictures and documentaries and things before, and I was always fascinated by it. I was waiting to get into the Icefall, and yeah, it was a spectacular experience, and it's just amazing. And I've been through Icefall so many times.
Mhm.
Every time you go in the Icefall, even during the same season, it's just
Mhm.
different. The route changes. The even like you in your mental space, you are trying to build certain milestones because hey, here I passed this, here I passed this, here I passed this. These are like bigger structures.
Mhm.
I mean, from a smaller structure perspective, you can't make mental mindsets, the mental milestones, because it's just difficult. It's
Mhm.
just snow and ice. It's all going to look the same. But
Mhm.
there are these massive, areas that you can say, okay, This one, yeah, now I remember. I need to pass through this. Next
Mm-hmm.
time you come, just not there, disappeared,
Yep.
broken into pieces, and all the debris lying around, and you would be wondering, I just walked past this. What if I walked past this and this, gave way? I would not even be alive. So, but
Yep.
anyway, it was a fascinating experience. So kind of you go through the ice fall, and then probably the most trickiest portion on the south side of Everest is at least resolved, or at least kind
Okay.
of taken care of.
Okay. So here the Sherpa guides will be fixing like ladders and stuff, and you can just walk through the ladders. This basically.
The ladders are of course fixed at areas where there are unsurmountable gaps between the crevasses, right? Like they would not fix just ladder arbitrarily.
Okay.
Like it's of course known for ladders, and people are fascinated by people crossing ladders in these massive like ice and snow structures, but they always try and, as I've gone to the south side so many times, have every time I've seen that Sherpas just become better and better every time at just finding areas where there are no ladders at all,
Okay.
because ladders mean risk, and
Yeah.
ladders also mean traffic. If
Yeah.
there are ladders that are like spanning 5 ladders joined together,
Yeah.
there's not a very good chance that many people can cross that ladder together, which means that if 80 or 100 Sherpa guides are going to move through the ice fall with 50 kgs on their back, it's going to be a choke point and a danger point, because now
Yeah.
they're all going to be spending a lot of time at an area where they could be exposed to a lot of risk.
Yep.
So they always try and find easier, or I would say relatively easier route through the ice fall, where even though it may be longer, they'll still try and kind of skip such like bigger obstacles. But yeah, uh, the Sherpa guides will be kind of finding the route every year
Mm-hmm.
and then fixing the route with ropes so that we can kind of safely pass through these areas. And they do this on rest of the mountain as well.
Yep, makes sense. So one of the things you mentioned earlier was working your way up towards the mountain and building camps like camp one, camp two, camp three, four, and so on. So what is that about, and how do you work your way up towards the mountain?
So Everest being a very commercial mountain, or I would say a mountain that is climbed every single year, with lot of people climbing it. There are no fixed camps on the mountains. I'm not saying permanent camps. I'm just saying fixed camps, meaning that there's a area which is called Camp One. As soon as you cross the Khumbu Ice Fall and you like a little higher, you get to this kind of an entrance of a massive valley, and that's the start of an area called the Western Coombe, and that is Camp One. So you kind of set your camp there, and then that at the end of Western Coombe, meaning at the end of the valley where there's a massive wall which is called the Lhotse face, just at the start of the face, right, like towards the edge of the mountain, you have a sort of again a relatively safe area where you set up the camp too. There's a bit of area, flat area, and there's where you set up the camp too. And you have good food and good everything available here, because we need to have a bigger station so that the Sherpas can also refuel and the Sherpas can recover, and everyone can kind of recover. And this is a safer place to do that, because beyond this, there's no space to kind of set up really good camps. As soon as you hit the Lhotse face, it's a wall which is like on average about 45-50 degrees all the way to the top. So
Yeah.
now on a wall like this, you can't have a flat space. So people
Yeah.
literally, we cut a campsite in between on this wall. So you literally just, you will see Sherpas going to an area where they'll just cut the entire snow out, and they'll create a flat ground in between like a 45-degree wall.
Okay.
And this is called the Camp 3.
Okay.
Camp 3 is also where most people, once they start beyond Camp 3, they start taking supplementary oxygen,
Okay.
because Camp 3 is approximately 23,000 feet, and beyond that, people are practically on oxygen.
Okay.
And then you finally get to an area called the South Col.
Okay.
Uh, this is also it's a flat ground. It almost is so desolate and wind blown, because it's like a col or a pass.
Okay.
It's like a saddle between a couple of mountains. On one side there's Everest, and on the other side there's Lhotse, and it's the saddle that connects both the mountains. And there's a huge, massive, like a football grounds kind of a size flat area, and that's called the South Pole. But it's perennially wind driven, perennially wind blown all the time. Now you are at about 26,000 feet, which is also known as the death zone.
Okay.
Um, I think
So
up
which means
here,
that if you die at an altitude above the dead zone, your body is not coming back.
probably on the south side, your body may come back. On the north side, probably not coming back,
Okay.
because just the challenges on north side are a lot harder compared to south side, higher up the mountain. But dead zone, I mean, multiple ways of thinking about it. I think beyond 8,000 meter, it becomes much trickier to naturally acclimate to the altitude. And more time you spend inside that area, you are potentially likely to die. So that's one. And two, being in some literal sense, there's about 100, odd dead bodies lying in this area or above this area, and which is why it's also called the death zone,
Yeah.
because so many people die here.
Mhm.
So uh, that's the final camp. And generally, most people will not spend a lot of time here. You come
Yeah.
to this camp around 3, 4 in the afternoon, maybe spend 4, 5 hours here, and then at around 9 o'clock in the night, you kind of start marching towards the top,
Okay.
and you get to the top. So that's generally, how the campsites work. There are 4 campsites on the south side, and similarly on the north side, you have about 3 campsites. You have
Okay.
Camp 1, you have Camp 2, and you have Camp 3.
Okay.
You have one more camp below Camp 1, and so in some sense there are 4 camps even on the north side, but they just call something the camp below Camp 1 as something else. They
Okay.
call it the advanced base camp. So it's
Okay.
just different terminology that is kind of being used on both the sides. But net, both the sides have 4 camps
Okay.
as you kind of march for the summit. And yeah,
Makes sense. Also, like, so when you march to the summit, there is this block. I mean, like the steep face called the Hillary Step. So, I mean, I've seen videos, and then it's quite scary with thousands of feet of exposure beneath you. So, how was your experience, and how do you climb the Hillary Step?
well, first, I feel, or at least I think, the Hillary Step got dislodged in the 2015 earthquake.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of massive boulders that kind of denote or kind of like, high, or like once you see those boulders, you are at Hillary Step. Those 2 boulders probably were dislodged during the 2015 earthquake, or who knows when. Everyone speculates that they were dislodged in the 2015 earthquake.
Okay.
Uh, or some even speculated that they are hidden beneath a lot of snow. That, in my opinion, is not possible. And if you look at the photos from past and compare these days photos, those boulders are clearly missing. They're not hidden beneath any snow. If they are
Mhm.
hidden beneath any snow, you would realize, that there's fair bit of snow cover around all of those things.
Mhm.
Now let's go with the mindset that it's gone. Okay. Um, we had already heard from a lot of people in 2016 who had submitted before us that the step is gone. So we didn't know what to expect, because we had just heard, few
Okay.
things that this is what is there, this is what is there. And as you start from the Camp 4 and you start climbing towards the summit, you spend fair bit of time climbing something which is called the triangular face on Everest.
Okay.
And you hit the first area which is called the balcony. And it's also called the
Okay.
balcony because the view from there is just like how it would be from a balcony of a massive high rise. Like you would
Yeah.
just get a amazing vantage point of the entire world from there. So like you get there, and it also has the triangular face itself is super steep, like probably again about 50-degree average angle, and there's no space to rest. There's no space to sit. It's all just steep climb, and you get to finally balcony where there's the first flat ground that you actually encounter on the summit push of Everest.
Okay.
From there, you climb the entire south ridge, going all the way up to South Summit.
Okay.
And South Summit is this fake summit, or this, maybe I would not call it a fake summit because it's not a fake summit. It's still a summit. But when you are standing at South Col and you're looking towards Everest, you see South Summit, and
Okay.
you think that's the top of Everest. But the moment you reach the top of Everest, or the so-called top of Everest from there, you suddenly realize there's a whole mountain in front of you remaining,
Oh.
because the summit of Everest is still almost about 2 hours away from there. So
Oh.
get to South Summit, and then you have to start this portion called the Cornice Traverse, which is a very exposed traverse which leads you to the Hillary step.
Okay.
And now that the step doesn't exist anymore, when we got to the step, it was primarily a snow slope.
Okay.
The good thing about a step is that a step is a solid thing out there and
Yeah.
something that you can kind of depend on, something can depend on to hold on to and climb. With the step gone, it is insanely crazy because there's this very thin snow slope or a snow ridge going, and it's now exposed on both sides.
Okay.
Initially, it was always exposed on the right side, meaning towards the Tibet side, but now it's even exposed towards the Nepal side because the step is not there. Otherwise, the step was, something that was kind of acting as, blocking the exposure.
Yeah.
But now the step is not there, so you have to kind of, just climb on this extremely exposed snow ridge.
Exposure as in like if you fall, you're gone.
If you fall, you're gone. You're like going to go all the way down to Camp 2.
Wow.
Or if you're going to fall on the Tibet side, you're potentially going to go all the way down to the base of the mountain. It's
Oh.
like that massive of a face on the Tibet side, or for
Mhm.
that matter, even on the Nepal side. It's like potentially 10,000 feet of drop.
Wow.
So yeah, it's like really bad. The exposure on this part of Everest, or especially on the snow slope, because when you are even walking on the Cornice Traverse, you're still probably blocked. The exposure is blocked towards the Tibet side by the Cornice itself.
Okay.
But the moment you get on the Hillary step or the slope of the Hillary slope, you're now no longer, there's no blockage. You just exposed everywhere. So that bit is now a little scary. I don't know how it is in the recent past, like in the last year or so. I don't know, I haven't seen any recent pictures. Maybe if someday I go back again, I will, get to experience it.
Yeah.
But then once you're on top of Hillary step, I think you were just like kind of, a lot of people had told me you are almost there. Like, and so I remember there are three snow humps that you have to cross, and the angle extremely subsides. Like all the way until South Summit, you're always climbing at an angle of 50 degrees, 55
Mhm.
degrees. Some of the pitches are even maybe steeper than that. The moment you're above Hillary Step, the angle is like 20 degrees. And you're
Oh.
like, wow, this is okay now. I can just, relax and walk at my pace. And the summit is maybe about 15 minutes away. And you just walk and you walk, get over the first snow hump, get over the second snow hump. And then as you start approaching the third snow hump, you can far in the distance start seeing people on the top with flags and kind of enjoying and just
Mhm.
celebrating their time on the top. So then you are also mentally like, okay, I'm now on the top. So that's the kind of like the experience that we have on the summit day.
Mhm. Makes sense. Like typically, some people say that you should return no matter what, like no later than 2 p.m. So why that time and like what when do you leave usually?
Look, I think a lot of those things are, these are, I would say, good guidelines. I would not say they are rules because many people have done many different things outside of this scope. The thing is that generally in on Everest, as the day passes, the weather tends to turn. Like the weather tends to turn in terms of there's more precipitation of snow happening. There's a whiteout that engulfs the mountain, and there's a lot of bad things that could happen. So that's the weather bit less, later on in the day. For example, most people will want to summit early in the morning so that they are back down to Camp 4 by, let's say, anywhere between 11 to 1 to 2 p.m. Okay, so that they can also plan their journeys back down. Uh, the good thing is also that they are climbing in the night.
Mhm.
This also means that if there's, as you walk in the night, as I mentioned earlier, the temperatures in the night being colder, the ice and the snowpack in the night is going to hold up really well.
Okay.
So climbing in that kind of a snow and ice pack is much easier. And then you come down. If you have done all of it in good time, then even when you're coming down, the ice and the snow conditions are really going to be good. Now, in my case, I got stuck in a lot of traffic. I submitted at 9:30.
Okay.
I started my journey back down at 10 o'clock. And again, I hit a lot of traffic while my way down. which also meant that I reached the camp 4 down really late in the afternoon around 3 o'clock. But
Okay.
that also means that I was climbing the triangular face down at around 1 in the afternoon.
Oh.
Now, if the weather is good, where there's just, light fog or light whiteout, but otherwise there's no precipitation happening and the sun is really baking,
Mhm.
all of this is now going to be slush. So now suddenly you're climbing down in slush snow.
Oh, wow.
So it's not a very smart strategy. So I think the 2 o'clock is merely a guideline, A, because it is assuming that you have started maybe at 9 o'clock in the night, which
Okay.
also means that if you're not back down by 2 o'clock, potentially you have run out of oxygen.
Okay.
Or if you are on the summit, now you are in legitimate trouble because now you have used up a lot of your oxygen.
Yeah.
And if you don't have oxygen, you are going to be struggling coming back down.
Yeah.
Now, that said, there was a team that knew that there's going to be a lot of traffic jams on the mountain that elected to go on a different day and that elected a different strategy where they started at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
So if they are starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, you can't expect them to be back down or, have
Mm.
a cutoff time of 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So they were back down around 7 or 8 o'clock in the night, back down to Camp 4.
Makes
Now
sense.
they took a calculated risk because they had a better idea about the weather and how the weather conditions were. They didn't want to run into any people. They wanted like a clean route on the mountain, and so there's a whole bunch of things that can
Mhm.
go on.
But some people are quite obsessed and then they just want to reach the summit, so they would just carry on. Some might die in the attempt as well.
I think most of them who are obsessed, and it is a real thing which is called summit fever.
Yeah.
And I think the closer you are to the summit, and once you kind of have an eyeball or an eye range of the summit, I think that fever gets a lot more obsessive. Um, and given the fact that lack of oxygen and sometimes just lack of training and understanding your body's limitations, of how hard it can push or where that boundary is, not having that understanding of that boundary, I think a lot of those people kind of get into trouble where they are like, I will do it. Like it's just a little bit remaining. It's just a little bit remaining. But I just don't think that they have that understanding that I think it's the time to bail. So they are the ones who get in trouble. If they don't end up dying, they end up injuring themselves and then needing rescues and then putting a lot of Sherpa lives at risk and those kind of things. But yeah, it's a it's a
And
it's a round trip journey.
exactly.
It's like how Ed we used to say that getting to the top is optional, but
Coming back is mandatory.
coming back down is mandatory. And for me, I kind of have, I think Ed meant what I'm going to say now, but he just like had a much shorter sentence. I think coming back down alive and in one piece is mandatory.
Yep.
Just to kind of say, so yeah, sure, you came back down, but it was a dead body that came down. How
Yeah.
helpful is that? Or sure, you came down, but with a terrible lung infection or snow blindness, or your fingers cut and your toes cut. I don't think that's the way I want to come down. So
Yeah.
I think kind of furthering that idea, it has to be getting to the top is definitely optional, but back down alive and one piece absolutely mandatory.
Also, one of the things while you were mentioning the slope, like with lots of exposure, climbing is a bit. I mean, it's difficult, but you're just looking up. But while coming down, descending, it's quite tough. I mean, you can just slip to one of the ridges and stuff. So, how do you descend such at such high altitudes?
Right. So um, on a mountain like Everest, you can't descend in the traditional style of descending down a mountain using a device. You literally just have to hold the rope and you just have to walk down.
So
And so
there's like a rope there,
there's a
which
rope. So
okay,
you're holding and you're walking down. And of course, most of us train long, long, long durations in this kind of a mindset. So it's not like I just showed up on Everest and I'm now climbing down. That said, there is fair bit of risk, right? Because if I lose focus for a moment and I lose my foot or I lose my placement and I let go of my hands or I fall and it's a steep slope, then I could fall long way down. And if there's no one along the way, then I could literally fall down to the next anchor, which could be many, many meters away, and potentially end up injuring myself badly, or like, breaking bones, or even like getting into some serious trouble.
Yeah.
Luckily, Everest on the south side is slightly more forgiving because the terrain is mostly snow. If you fall in snow when you are coming down, it's a lot of slushy snow, less likely to get injured badly. But on the Tibetan side, the terrain is all rock and ice, and the terrain is not at an angle of 45, 50 degrees. Many, many, many portions are 90 degrees,
Oh,
85 degrees. One mistake, you're going to die. It's not going to be breaking bones or like, just getting saved somehow. One mistake and you're going to die on the north side. So that's like the stark contrast between the two sides.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, you have to be like hyper focused when coming down, because it could just be as simple as sitting down to take a break, right? But God knows what's going on in your body. Maybe you just get a massive heart attack and you just die there sitting.
Oh, wow.
Like, or you just fall asleep,
And you need
right?
to keep moving at that high
You need to keep moving. You need to get out of there.
Yeah.
The more you are spending time at that altitude, you're not in a safe zone. You need to get out. You need to get out as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And the smarter thing would be one step in front of another, and just, like, kind of being focused in the moment, and like not not taking, a pedal off the gas. Like,
Mhm.
sometimes you're like, okay, I've got to the top.
Yeah.
Oh, done, man. No, it's not done. Not done until you get back down to the base camp. So that
Yeah.
focus level can't go down until you are back down to the base camp, and then sure, you can enjoy.
But like, what goes into your mind? Because it's tiring, it's exhausting. You cannot think properly at this high altitude. So like, what goes into your mind? How do you motivate yourself?
I don't think I needed any motivation or anything. It was my life. If I need motivation to stay alive, I think God help me on, those altitudes. God help me anywhere if I need motivation to stay alive. Uh, I think for me, it was very clear. I need to get back down to Camp 4 and then reassess what my energy levels are, and what my focus levels are. But until then, I'm just going to stay razor focused, even if it means tapping into like the most reserves of my mind and my body. Like, this is it. I had to stay alive. And I knew that a couple of places I was extremely tired. Like, tired in the sense I've never been this tired in my life. Tired to a point where you could give up tired. Like, and I was like, let's just take it easy. So like, I would find a place where I could potentially just sit. So sit and like, take a few deep breaths, and you're like, let's just relax. Maybe 5 minutes of break is going to give me enough energy to kind of move again. And then you just move again. I'm constantly repeating myself,
Yeah.
not sitting until I'm getting, to my tent. And so I remember on that day, I got to my tent in South Cole, and I was like, I have no reserves. There's like, if Mingma comes down, Mingma was about half an hour behind me, and if he comes down and tells me that, Kuntal, 1 hour break and we are going down to the next camp, I would have said not possible. I
Okay.
knew there was just nothing for me to give. And once Mingma came, I said, I want to sleep here. And while this is not what we
Okay.
had pre-decided that I'm going to sleep at Camp 2.
Okay.
Uh, but Camp 2 is minimum 6 to 7 hours away at my, and like at my energy levels or my effort levels. I simply don't have 6 hours. I will make a mistake. I will get
Yeah.
there. I know that I have enough in me that I'll not die. But I also know that the chances of making mistakes between here and Camp 2 are a lot higher. And I
Mhm.
don't want to make mistakes. And now that it's 4 o'clock in the evening, as we descend, it's going to be night. It's going to get colder. It's going to get windier. And I don't want to make a mistake in this kind of an environment.
Mhm.
So I was like, let's just sleep here. We have extra oxygen. We don't have food. I don't need food. I can
Okay.
easily get by without eating anything.
Okay.
So food is not a problem. I don't need to fuel myself. I
Mhm.
can, just go off my reserves tomorrow until the next camp, and we know there's food at next camp, and I'll just,
Okay.
grab a bite before we finally get to camp 2.
Mhm.
So there's a whole bunch of these calculations that are going on in your mind. Uh, and for me, because I had done an 8,000 before, and I knew, that this is how you can kind of manage yourself. So it was a lot easier. Sometimes people who have not done 8,000s, or people who don't have enough experience, they are kind of ones who get in trouble because they just don't have the mental bandwidth to do these calculations or
Mhm.
to think through all these things. And they're just dependent on their Sherpa guides. And
Makes
they're
sense.
just dependent on their Sherpa guides and team to kind of, get them out of hole.
Okay.
Sometimes that is not a smart idea.
Yeah, I mean, you don't also feel like eating at that altitude or not drinking, but you need to make sure that you drink enough water at least.
Right. So that altitude is much tougher to drink because your body is also conserving oxygen for the more critical functions, and your body can last without food for a while, like
Yeah.
for a good chunk of time. So it's not like it's the most crucial function when given that there's hardly any oxygen it's getting. And the basic functions, of contracting muscles or your heart or running your brain and filtering the blood and all of those, basic functions are more important than eating and digesting food.
Yeah.
Your body knows there's a whole bunch of fat reserves that can be used as energy, so it's not like it's depleted, to crazy levels. It's not. There's, enough reserves for it to get by. So uh, but when you're kind of coming down, you're also finished the summit, so you're also in some sense of like a little relief. So maybe you also want to eat,
Yeah.
but in my case it was like I have nothing to eat. Uh,
Yeah.
Whatever I had has been finished. And and because I planned it in a way that I'm going to be at camp 2,
Yeah.
there's nothing for me here. So let's just get out of here, but sleep a night. Because if I had to choose between sleep and food,
Yeah.
if I went without food for a day, can I go without food for one more day? Heck yes, I can.
Yeah.
But if I don't sleep and recover, how- I am not going to be able to get down to camp 2 very easily. So
Yeah.
I think these are the kind of choices we have to make. But yeah, I think this is what we train for. This is what we work so hard for during our training regime to kind of tackle these issues when they happen.
And like, how do you like poop and stuff? Like, I'm sure like people must not like, be showering
No, no,
at
no
the
one
camp.
showers. Other than the base camp, no one really showers. At base camp, we have these makeshift showers where you will just take a bucket and maybe take a bucket shower, or maybe bucket with a tap,
Okay.
and like just like hang it somewhere and like stand under it. Yeah, I mean the fancier teams who charge like $100,000 and $150,000, they have fancier showers. and
Okay.
and like I remember going to visiting one of these teams. They had their entire bathroom, the floor was heated.
Oh.
And I'm like, what? Like, like, are you here to climb Everest? Why do you need this kind of stuff? Just live by basic things.
Yeah.
But again, to each their own. Um, but in terms of poop and everything at base camp, at least it's quite regulated, with people pooping in big like barrels, and then these barrels are kind of carried out and disposed of lower down in a village called Namche Bazaar, where there's like I think a waste disposal facility or some recycling facility or something. I don't remember. But higher up the mountain, of course, it's a lot more challenging. You can't carry the barrels up. So people find crevasses and will build toilet tents on top of crevasses, or stuff like that, where then people will just go and poop there, and those kind of things. And then as you go higher up into the snow areas, uh, there's these enclosures that are dug in snow, and then you kind of go and poop inside that. And then at South Col, people just go and poop anywhere. So unfortunately, I think this is not the best thing to do, because it'd be smarter to poop at a single place, maybe in like a plastic bag or something, and then just at the end of the expedition carry the plastic bag down. But then there are close to 800-900 people on the mountain,
Yeah.
and it's just logistically a nightmare to manage at these altitudes. How can you get the poop out? And no one's going to put in all this effort,
Because things don't
unfortunately.
decompose at that altitude.
No, that poop is going to stay there forever and ever. It's not going to decompose ever. It's like what, -20, -30 degrees lower down the mountain, and then -40 higher up the mountain. It's a high altitude refrigerator. The poop is just going to sit there. It's not going to decompose or anything. Even
Yeah.
with sun and everything, it's nothing is going to decompose out there. Like dead bodies have stayed forever and ever. Nothing, skin and muscles intact. So yeah, this is a big problem on the mountain, unfortunately. Hopefully as people get stronger and fitter, and more prepared, and as they come on the mountain and as they are become more responsibly, hopefully they'll carry their poop down. And many more problems on the mountain. I think slow and steadily, a lot of them are getting resolved. So this one will also get resolved in time.
Yep. And like one last point, which is one thing you mentioned was that Everest is a very guided mountain in a sense, a lot of Sherpa guides. So how different are things on any other 8,000-meter peak? And like how do people like set up camps or maybe, set up ropes and stuff?
All 8,000-meter mountains at a commercial level are guided, are fixed by Sherpa guides, are run by Sherpa guides from bottom to top, unless you are doing it in a serious alpine style. Like, a lot of people will claim that they did the mountain solo, that they did the mountain alpine style, that they did all of these ways. But the moment you use the same route that a Sherpa has opened, the moment you clip yourself in a rope that the Sherpa has fixed, the moment you spend a night in the tent that a Sherpa has fixed, the moment you ate the food that a Sherpa cooked for you, or the water that a Sherpa made for you, it's no longer alpine style or no longer solo. Just because you walk to the top without a guide on your side doesn't mean anything. Okay. True solo style or true alpine style means where you do everything yourself. Which, for example, one of my friends, Yost Kabush, who was also the guy who saved my life in the
Yeah, the
2015
video
earthquake.
guy.
Yeah. So he is climbing Everest in winter right now.
Okay.
He is carrying all his gear himself to the base camp. He is going to pitch his tent at the base camp himself. He is going to eat the food, cook the food for himself at the base camp. All the way from base camp to the summit, he is going to fix the ropes himself, carry the gear himself, find the route himself, do everything himself, all the way to the top. And he's going to do it without oxygen.
Oh,
This, in my opinion, is true solo style. So if people want to claim solo style, I think they have to do this way. If you are eating or if you're using help of Sherpas all the way to the last camp, and then just from the last camp to the top, you're walking without one, that's not solo. So I think, people need to kind of understand what solo means. But to be very frank, there are very few people who climb mountains in the style that Yosh does. Majority of people will take some help of Sherpas to a certain level.
yeah.
Uh, and so, to be very frank, 99.9% of 8,000ers are climbed on the back of a Sherpa.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to claim on this planet, I know what the truth is. I have seen there, I have been there. They are all climbing on the back of a Sherpa, including me. And I have no problem saying that. I'm actually honored to climb alongside Sherpas, honored to learn from them, honored to be there, experience their camaraderie, experience their love, and experience their friendship. I'm honored to do all of those things. So they, in some sense, are the true superstars of Himalayan climbing in all senses.
Yep, definitely. And so like when you say fixing ropes, does that mean like going first, like breaking ice and then setting up ropes and everything?
Yep.
Okay.
Like literally the first humans to walk that season,
Okay.
find the path, attach the rope on the mountain using anchors in either rocks or snow or ice or anywhere, assessing the safety, ensuring that these are all bulletproof anchors all the way to the top, getting to the camp, pitching all the tents, creating a tent platform, pitching the tents, setting up the stove, cooking the food, making water, getting in, ice or snow from somewhere. All of this stuff is done by the Sherpas. I haven't seen many climbers do. Actually, I haven't met a climber personally yet who has done every single of this thing from the bottom of the climb to the top of the climb, other than Yost. He's the only guy I have actually met in person who has done all of this himself.
Okay, so like even people like Ed Wisters, they would use some sort of Sherpa help.
Correct.
Makes
So while
sense.
Ed has climbed all these mountains without supplementary oxygen. I don't think Ed ever claims that he has done it in alpine style or solo or anything like that.
Okay, makes sense. Fair enough. Awesome. So we're at the last section of the podcast, which is again a rapid fire round. So like 5 questions. The first things that come to your mind. So your expeditions are incomplete without.
Because it's a rapid fire, and whatever comes to my mind first, I'm going to say the first thing. Honestly, but I'll say two things here. The first thing is a Coke at the end of the expedition. I remember when I exited the ice fall, and right there in the distance, my cook Nima Tamang was standing, and he knew that I love a Coke after the expedition. And while everyone celebrates by drinking a beer or alcohol, I don't drink. So he had gotten a Coke for me specially, and so I remember like removing my bag and like running in Bollywood style and like like hugging him and like thanking him, and it was good fun. But yeah, I think expeditions are not I think are incomplete without just going to that emotion itself of gratitude towards the mountains, gratitude towards everyone who has been part of the journey. I think it's a big thing for me especially.
Mhm. Also, like since one of the things you mentioned that you carry a lot of gear with you, and some of that gear might be, I mean, like now you use all vegan gear. So, what's your favorite vegan brand?
Has to be Save the Duck. When every single brand on the planet said no to me, I still till date go back to every of that message that I have sent to a Mountain Hardware or a Prima Loft or a North Face or a Rab in my email, in my Facebook messages. I still read those messages and their rejections, and then going through all this for 3 4 years and having to climb Everest one time while wearing a dead animal on my body, and then finally finding Save the Duck. Still have that message when they said yes. Uh, can you call us? And I was like so excited talking to the chief marketing officer who said yes, we will do it. And then actually getting that piece of equipment, wearing that and submitting Lhotse, potentially I feel as the first ever human to climb an 8,000-meter mountain without consuming an animal or using an animal. I do think Save the Duck, again, coming back to that concept of gratefulness, I
Mhm.
am grateful to Save the Duck for helping me achieve the biggest dream of my life, which is climbing Everest in a vegan style without eating or wearing animals. So
Mhm.
without a shadow of doubt, it has to be Save the Duck.
Mhm. So, let's say if you're stuck on a mountain in one of the camps, there's like snowstorm or whiteout. How would you kill your time?
I generally enjoy music, so I will end up listening to music potentially. Or I think one of my favorite activities is sleeping. So I'll probably just fall asleep. Like I can, like a lot of people struggle on the mountains because they can't fall asleep very early.
Mhm.
Like on mountains, I will fall asleep by 7 o'clock in the evening at base camp or at about let's say 7:30 by latest. But as we start going higher and higher up the mountain, I will start falling asleep by 5:30 in the evening, and then I'll stay asleep until next morning 6 7 o'clock.
Oh.
And one of the secrets why I also recover very well on the mountains is that I am able to sleep this level. I think once you kind of start getting long drawn sleeps, your body kind of just gets that time to rebuild, recover, do whatever it needs to take. Because there's two components to recovery. One is your physical, but one is also your mental. And I think given enough sleep, so enough of that deep sleep so that your physical body can recover, but also enough of REM sleep so that your kind of brain can rewire. I do think, both of those things are important. And a lot of people just kind of miss on this because either they are just too busy partying on the mountain, getting drunk, and just, drinking shit ton of coffee. They have to each their own again.
Yeah.
I feel for me, when I am on the mountain, like sleep falls in the non negotiable category. I'm not compromising my sleep for anything.
Yep. Scariest experience on Everest.
Has to be the 2016 avalanche, not the 15 avalanche. 15 avalanche is well known, but 16 avalanche when we were crossing a ladder. I had just crossed the ladder and I was like standing near Mingma, and one of my other friends was just about to cross the ladder, and then we hear this loud, massive boom on top of us. You're in middle of icefall. There's nowhere to run. There's no tent to hide behind. There's nothing to hide behind. I remember Mingma saying, like just duck. And then kind of the first thought going through my mind, 2 years I have gotten, saved. This doesn't look I'm going to, make out alive out of this. And then 10 seconds later, just kind of seeing the debris pass by. I was like, man, this is like, I'm like getting too many, breaks on the mountain. Like I think one more, stuff like this happens, I'm not going to catch a break anymore now. So
Yeah.
that was kind of, really scary.
Okay. And lastly, your favorite memory on Everest except the summit attempt?
I think it has to be on the north side. So Mingma and I have been climbing together for almost 6-7 years now,
Okay.
and both of us are very dear friends of each other, almost like brothers to each other
So
now.
is this the same Mingma featured in the documentary 14 Peaks?
It is the same Mingma Tenzin Sherpa, who
Yeah.
wears, I don't know who's featured in that documentary. It may be Mingma David Sherpa, but I don't remember who's featured in that documentary.
Okay.
But Mingma Tenzin Sherpa is he works with Nims Dai, and
Okay.
he is also the guy who fixed ropes to the top of K2 in winters
Yeah.
and made that dream come true for the 10 Nepalis, and the last biggest thing remaining in the world of high altitude mountaineering. So both of us have been climbing together for a very long time, and I remember in 2000, and Mingma also knows how much I've given to Everest and how much I've kept my life aside on Everest, that I don't have a family because Everest is my family in some sense.
Yeah.
And in 2019, my wife and I got pregnant, and no one knew. It was me, my wife, my mother, and my sister. Only four people knew about this. And then I was on the mountain, and Mingma knew I was a little bit off. And I remember one of the days we were walking towards the North Pole wall, and Mingma was like, "You seem off. What's going on?" Like, and then I told, narrated Mingma that, like, I'm going to become a father and everything. And I remember the tight hug that Mingma gave. And he was like, I think he was more happy than I was. He was on like top of the world. He's like, finally, like, you are going to experience, the fatherhood, and you are going to experience this, newer journey that you are kind of going on. And he was like super happy. All of that happened. And since then, he's always patient. But after, hearing that, he was like ultra, ultra, ultra patient to a point that he took care of me like a newborn child. And like, he just protected me, like, as until we finally were, getting down from the summit, is where he got so pissed at me because I was so tired. I was so tired. In 7 years, I'd never seen Mingma get angry on anyone. Like, for me, he never got angry. Like, he doesn't get angry. Like, to see Mingma angry is like a once in a blue moon kind of a thing. And I saw him getting angry on me for the first time in my entire life. But I was so tired. But until then, he was like, whatever I did, he like was like, no, 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 we need to get on the top, whatever, and this that. But so it was good fun. I really always kind of appreciate what he has done for me, and always is, comes back to me, like, the smile on his face in that moment always comes back to me. It's like, wow, he's so happy for me, like, like, genuinely, like, no, not like, unadulterated, happiness or unadulterated friendship, is like, I think we share between each other, and it continues till date, even though we haven't climbed with each other for almost a year and a half, and he now works with a different company, and he's so busy, and all of this, but yet, we kind of share that bond between each other. So yeah.
I mean, this was an amazing conversation. Like, that's the right segue to our previous conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
No, not a problem. Happy to do this.
I hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode with Kuntal. And please subscribe to Nails and Hammers on the platform of your choice.